Thank you very much, Ashok, and thank you very much also for the invitation, Awais, for this opportunity also to share what we are trying to do. So I have thought of highlighting like a footprint of philosophy at the University of Pretoria, particularly philosophy of psychiatry and mental health, philosophy of medicine as well. And I've selected visible. I could have, of course, also selected some other places like what happens with PhD students and so on, but selecting these three areas is about a postgraduate MPhil program in the philosophy of ethics of mental health, and to talk about what happens at the undergraduate training of medical students as a philosophy into practice kind of example, and also in perhaps surprisingly with research ethics training where philosophy is featuring through philosophy in action through values-based practice. So what the first entails this MPhil program is in philosophy and ethics of mental health, and it's got two components to it: an assignment component or traditional taught component, and more research, conceptual research component, which is the writing of 4 essays. The assignments are done on each of the modules, as you can see there, and read there for yourself after written on any of the relevant topics or any relevant topic of their interest. And people do this program from various places in the world, as it's entirely based through our virtual media. But more about those assignments. So the assignments they do through guided reading and doing exercises and making so-called notes in the margins. And these are all prompted by questions. It's based on the Oxford textbook of philosophy and psychiatry and some key selected articles. The 4 essays, they get, before embarking on these, they get guidance on philosophical writing, and then they submit a title and a structural outline for each essay. They get feedback on that, and then they write various iterations of each essay and get comments following each subsequent draft. And more details of this program you may find there at that webpage you see there at the bottom of the page. At undergraduate level, well, I say undergraduate, but it's of course not universally the same. These are, in the States, it's different, for example, but these are medical students in the sense that they are, in American terms, it would be MD students. And we've got a 6-year program for that. And they first, initially, the idea was for them to write on values-based practices of philosophy and action. And the instruction was to write on their learning about values and their personal learning about values in medicine. Of course, the aims were that this should be personal, and that we wanted to create a freedom through this this slide, which is about the history with exposing medical students to values-based practice. And the process we went through, and I think we got to this. The idea was to then specify their interests specifically and ask them to write on their learning of diversity and conflict in values in medicine. But still the engagement was not quite what we would have liked, and it was more regurgitation of information than a more in-depth engagement. So we take this, made it more real to get them to do a real-life case study, where they would go to a community health clinic and find a family with adolescents, and then have to identify legitimate values of the family, the members of the family, and health personnel that are relevant in the further healthcare delivery to this family, and then identify potential conflicts. A few students would still say they could not find any real conflicts, and that may be the case. And sometimes the view was too narrow on cultural values or only values in the family rather than all the role players. And we discovered through the years that they really needed a lot of guidance, instruction to identify the various values and not to go for too narrow a set, and then to identify and how to identify the values, and actually also to try to address the process by which they would apply the practical pointers of values-based practice. There's also a computer-based training component in this values-based training among where we use about 130 questions specifically on values-based practice. Also rather difficult questions, guiding them through processes, thinking processes rather than rote learning. They prefer rote learning. The thinking process they find quite onerous. And to encourage them to do so, they have to do various sets of these until they achieve 90% for each set. And once they've achieved 90% for a set, then they can move on to the next set until they really have accomplished it all. So this is really a formative process of learning using assessment in that formative way. There's for the 6th year, so we've used that set of questions particularly for the 2nd year, and then for the 6th year it's just less questions where we use the formative proficiency testing before and after some compulsory reading, and interesting after the reading there's most recently there's been an increase in the class average on this specific component of 39 percentage points. So it helps to read, I suppose, is the message there. Quite excitingly, the medical curriculum is currently being reformed, and the choice of the curriculum committee, now endorsed by the faculty, is that the highest value in the curriculum should be that the curriculum should be values-based, person-centered. And of course, that is quite an achievement for values-based practice and person-centeredness to have been identified as such. There is the risk, though, of lip service and tokenism. And to address that and avert mere lip service, that we have begun a project where we've identified a lecture champion for each clinical discipline. And with these champions, we are developing case narratives for each discipline for future use in teaching and learning. And so my computer does that automatically. And this whole project is subject to research, a formative component and reflective research component. And we want to compile all these case narratives in a book as a resource. In spite of that, we might still have some difficulty to integrate this values-based person-centered approach across all models of the faculty or clinicians. And as you know, medical students quite often learn more from the role models than from what they are being taught and the other educational activities. So it's really important that we get role models to also sign up to and practice accordingly. But the champions would hopefully also help in mobilizing their respective disciplines and departments. Then the third area, which perhaps is a surprising footprint where we find philosophy in action, so to speak, that is a research ethics training, including health research ethics training. And this is a course that we've been running for the last few years across 9 faculties for the 120 academic departments of the University of Pretoria, which is quite a large university with about 70,000 students. And also for the National Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, which is a national council with about 1,600 researchers. And for this, we also have their research ethics committee, this training course for their research ethics committee, as well as for the various research ethics committees at the University of Pretoria. Each faculty has its own. So how this looks, the footprint here is that we really begin the program, this course, by this question: what is the scope of research ethics, and how would they go about in answering this question, and how could they get an answer to this question? Of course, this opens up the mold of a restrictive or impoverished, or even this narrow take quite often find in research ethics, as I've demonstrated, given examples there. is really to open up, and this is philosophy opening up regulatory ethics in a way, and that's right at the beginning of this program. And then in this opening session, we address ways of answering this question. Of course, one is to appeal to sapiential authority and what the limitations of doing so would be. And another approach would be to go for some theoretical and logical substance, and we consider how to narrow understanding of research ethics would matter. So how may we get to know this answer is by a substantive consideration of what ethics entail in scope. So this is the philosophy and practice, opening it up in terms of various kinds of values. And we, of course, we have quite a bit of a consideration of the scope of values and the various kinds. By looking at established approaches, to a very brief overview, and you can just already see this is opening up the various, opening the toolkit, so to speak, from restricted regulatory ethics to a much broader tool case afforded by philosophy. Of course, that question is also answered by looking at what research entails. What does that entail in scope? And quite often people have a somewhat limited take on that as well. So this opening up of the scope of the concepts really helps in answering those questions. That key question is philosophy in action, as I've said, and then also looking at decision theory and really taking philosophy and where values come to play specifically in key decisions, and very practically when it comes to the aim, the objectives, the design, the usual components of a research protocol, where values really come in at each of those places in a very practical way. So philosophy of mental health medicine is making its mark. It's growing, it's flourishing in this MPhil program, in the undergraduate medical curriculum, and research ethics trainings for researchers and research ethics committee members at the UP and the CSIR. Long live philosophy, I conclude, and I hope this has been inspiring to you all. Thank you.